Hi, everybody. Welcome to our DPM Academy series. This video is going to focus on KPI groups. Now, this is a hot topic, and we have quite a bit of content out there already. What we wanted to provide in this particular video is a deep dive on the anatomy of a KPI and the group itself, and also talk about troubleshooting. So we can cover some common pitfalls and also steps to take remediating actions and hopefully put some power back into your hands to be able to more easily configure the KPI groups for your DPM experience. I am the product manager for digital portfolio management. And with me, I have Aaron. Aaron, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is Aaron. I'm one of the engineers for DPM. I've been working with DPM pretty much since it's existed.
Yes, you got a lot of good deep dive knowledge on this, especially in the KPI group world. So thanks for jumping on this together with me today.
Yeah, excited. Mhm.
So, if we jump into it, we have a couple of key things on our agenda. So, the first is to just kind of give a basic understanding of a KPI group from like a definition point of view. We do have quite a few resources out there already that we're happy to share for more in-depth on that aspect of it. But what we really want to spend time on are the components or like the anatomy of a KPI group and the common pitfalls for what to do or what we've seen are, I guess, are common issues. And then we will jump into an instance, and Aaron's going to give us some really nice troubleshooting tips. And we'll actually show you, in the instance, what a lot of these records look like and how you can navigate those to better understand the KPIs that you're working with. Okay, so what are KPI groups, Aaron? I mean, where do we begin?
Yeah.
Um, I very like simply put, what you can see here on the screen is it's a KPI groups in and of itself is really kind of a framework that is built around performance analytics indicators, PA indicators. And what we allow or what we enable with that group is to more easily be able to map those indicators to your solutions in DPM. So it's a much more configurable, easily configurable experience versus having to, for say, like build out a custom dashboard using our next experience. So being able to quickly and easily map and unmap KPIs and kind of group KPIs together. A couple of the key benefits, like I mentioned, it's built around indicators. They are, easy to configure within the DPM workspace. We do provide an inheritance. So if you map a KPI group to, for example, in this view, you're seeing it's mapped to a service portfolio, it is inherited throughout that entire tree. And so it makes it a lot more simple versus having to map individual metrics or build out, almost the same dashboard for each individual level, of that portfolio to be able to view these metrics. And then we also include this capability of nesting indicators. So a lot of times when we've seen sample dashboards, there's a ton of metrics on one page, and can kind of become a little overwhelming what to look at. And so with this kind of framework, it allows you to create parent and supporting indicators so that you can provide your top level, most important metrics that you want a user to start with, and then when they drill down into that particular metric, they can get supporting indicators, so additional context to that kind of overarching initial data. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of flexibility. Yeah, go ahead, Aaron. What were you going to add?
I was just saying, yeah, and from like an engineering perspective, like, and you pointed it out, but I just really want to focus that the addition of making this easy to configure is really nice because otherwise, with having it being spread throughout all the different views, you would need to edit many pages inside of UIB. So the configurability is such a advantage to this as a whole with the tables that we have introduced. That to me is always like the best benefit.
I know if I can do it, anyone can do it. No, that's a really good point. I'm glad you called that out. And that was one of the main reasons why we wanted to move forward with this is to make it very easily configurable and very flexible.
Mhm.
So if we dig into a little bit, like what actually is a KPI group and what is the anatomy, we will dig into like some of these component parts of it. But if we look at this left side, KPI at the top, which represents, or like this label represents, everything kind of within this box. We have our KPI record, our indicator record, and then the indicator source. And then we basically group these individual KPIs into this concept of a KPI group. So this record then has a relationship to these individual KPI records. And you can then also create supporting indicators, which are kind of nested within here.
So, yeah, and I think with the probably the best example we have is like our performance snapshot. That's like a group, and then inside of that we have like many different KPIs, right?
Exactly. And you could put, I mean, there's no limit, right, Aaron, like to the
Mm.
number of indicators.
But yeah, that's one of the things too when it comes to configurability, like even the supporting ones, because then we can show, and I don't think we even have a limit on supporting either. So when you drill in, you can see all the different potentially related indicator or KPIs a part of that group. No, I mean that's really powerful because otherwise that just implementing something like that inside of UIB would be very difficult.
Yes, and we do have that particular view. So once the indicator is selected and you can view these supporting, it does give the user a full breakdown view of all the supporting indicators and even breaking down by child entity, so to speak. So there's a lot of really rich data that we can provide there. And I mean, one of the main use cases, if we think about why you might, or an example of a parent with supporting, you might have an incident that is, or like one of our indicators, you mentioned the performance snapshot. So we have an open incidents indicator at this parent level. And then at the supporting levels, we include some additional indicators around aging incidents, or of those open incidents, which ones are, P1s or P2s, or potentially a major incident. I think we also have the indicator around like an incident that was caused by a change. So you could also start to get more insights into the makeup of that open incidents group.
Yeah, that's really powerful.
So let's go into the anatomy. So, Aaron, this is like your area of expertise, right? This is
Yeah,
not at all simple. So, do you want to start walking us through
yeah,
how these KPIs are structured?
yeah, for sure. So we kind of saw at the high level you have a KPI group, and so the kind of example I was asking about was like a performance snapshot, but we have many that come out of box, and that your KPI group is just a collection of KPIs. Once you dig into that, you'll see you have this KPI record. And essentially, that record, one, is associated to a PA indicator, performance analytics indicator. But on our KPI, we have some additional values such as like aggregation, whether that's average or sum, latest score. You can also define like the different chart types, how you want it to be displayed inside of DPM. Now, once again, when you drill in further on that KPI record, you can drill in now to your kind of PA indicator, performance analytics indicator. And if you are familiar with that, well, good for you. You're familiar with the rest of everything now, but PA in itself is very complicated. So kind of like I guess a high level is by leveraging PA, what we do is we can basically then define the indicator. We can define what that indicator source is. We can define the breakdowns, and we can define when that data is collected via jobs. So that kind of indicator is the where that data is aggregated, or is maybe a better putting is how that data gets aggregated. And so, like I said, the kind of the starting point to all of that would be the indicator source. So that would be essentially the facts table or the table that defines where this data is being collected from, though that could also be scripted. And then in addition to that, with that indicator source, there's also this layer of conditions too. So it's not just where is the table being defined, but what is that data being defined from, essentially. Yeah, there's a lot more layers to that, and I think we'll get into it later, but there's more conditions on the indicator itself, as well as the breakdowns themselves essentially act as a dimension, but they also have conditions included as well.
So
Yeah.
all that to say, right, Aaron, like it's a lot. And the beauty and the curse of it is that it gives you a ton of flexibility and also precision to get exactly what you need to report on and how you need to report on it and where you need to report it. But to do that, or I should say, and to do that, it does require quite a bit of effort and understanding of how these are structured. You know,
Absolutely.
it really starts with that indicator source, like you said, getting that data, that source data, and then building on it with each of these like layers almost.
Yeah, exactly.
What we wanted to talk a little bit about, in addition to, this anatomy, were some of those key pitfalls, and we will actually jump into an instance so we can look at this in a little bit more detail. But I think this is a really nice visual to show all those different building blocks.
Yeah, and understanding the layers exist first is it will really help understanding why the score you're seeing is the way it is, and understanding like yeah that the anatomy of it is essentially, like you said, layered. That each way it's almost like it's filtered to then finally get that score. And so understanding how it's filtered will really understand what that score is, and once you truly understand it, then you can kind of configure things to get that precision or the exact, monitor the exact data you want.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing actually that I think would be useful to call out at this point as well is like it's easy to overlook at the KPI record because much of the configuration and the conditions are structured here. But the KPI record adds a layer of looking at those scores either as an aggregation or as the latest score of the indicator record.
Yeah.
And so if you are using this aggregation, which means you're taking an average or sum of those scores, in the DPM UI, there are start and end dates. And so if you're saying it's the average of a metric, then over those start and end dates, that number isn't going to be the latest score that was returned from the job, the PA job. It's actually going to be the average of those scores over that time period. And so that can also cause a lot of confusion. Again, it's easy to sort of lose sight of that
Yeah.
additional layer.
That's a very common pitfall. That's a good one to point out.
Yeah, well, so that's a great segue, right? Like, let's get into some of the pitfalls. Um, yeah, so we have at a high level, we have these 4 pitfalls. Aaron, you deal with cases and you support customers all the time in these. And so like walk us through what you see most common.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I see these often when we get essentially a customer opens a case and reaches out, and often these are kind of like the most common issues I see. Number one, missing breakdowns. So this is once you kind of get into the actual indicator itself, and all of our kind of indicators that we roll, we have our breakdowns. And what I mean by our breakdowns are we have the service offering, service portfolio. Essentially, we have breakdowns for all the different solution types in DPM. And the configuration, someone will add a customer or user will add a KPI with an indicator. And when you dig into that indicator level, you'll notice that that breakdown is missing those solution types. So, sorry, that indicator is missing those breakdown solution types they're expecting to see. And so without that, then that data doesn't get cut up or chopped up or get collected in that dimensions for us to even display inside of DPM. So it's really important to use the breakdowns that we provide. So that is, and you can kind of look at any of our existing KPIs and you can see it, and I'll probably show it later, but it's DPM service offering, DPM service, even business app, application service, all those solution types.
It's safe to say, right? All of our breakdowns are prepended with DPM and then a colon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's just to make it more consistent and easy to understand. Like those are the breakdowns that have our definitions. So next one, indicators not mapped to a job. This might maybe seem a little obvious, but it it is easy, very easy to miss that maybe it is associated to a job, but you really want to double check that that job is one active and how often is it actually running. That's very common that what we'll see is, maybe it is mapped and maybe sometimes it's not, but maybe that job has just not been active for a while for whatever reason, maybe due to an upgrade or due to some testing done. And then also sometimes if using your own job, you set that job to, or using an existing job that has been running 15 days and you're wondering why data is not showing up or why the data is stale. Well, usually that's a case of the job being an issue.
We have a
Mhm.
job, right, Aaron, that we ship, and that
Yes.
we have that set to run every 24
We
hours.
do. So we have two jobs actually that we have. So one is a nightly job that's run every 24 hours, like you said, and that's the one that should be active and always running. And sometimes it's as simple as that. If instances aren't showing data, it's because that job's not running. We also do come roll out with a second job, and this is more of a gather data, like historic data. So that's intended to be used if either there's data that wasn't calculated and you need to recalculate, or not calculate, but you need to recapture that data, then you can run that historic job. The daily job, it's very clearly labeled DPM, daily collection job, is the job you want to run. Want to automatically be running every day. So kind of associated with jobs still is that, I kind of guess I jumped the gun there a little bit, but their fail to collect data would be the second part of this. So there's all sorts of reasons. Luckily, the PAs, it's like sys jobs or their jobs have a job log. They have like a dedicated log that actually will tell you if there's errors or warnings, things like that. And so often it's actually very verbose and very helpful to determine like, oh, maybe one of my indicator sources are flawed. Maybe my customize the breakdown source and the breakdown data is incorrect or the script is wrong. You can get all that data actually from the job running and failing. And or even sometimes the job will actually completely run and it will collect data for like half the indicators, but the other half won't collect for whatever reason. So that's always just like a valuable spot to kind of start looking in general, but definitely common that anything in there could be failing and causing the whole job to fail. It does happen. And then finally, the kind
Yeah,
of,
this last one's is a doozy, isn't it?
yeah, this one, the other ones I wasn't verbose on. This is going to be even more. So this one is I'll just read it: data inaccuracy, misalignment, and misunderstanding. And this is an issue of, more often or not, kind of not understanding exactly how the data is being collected. So, what I mean by that is, first, KPI, once again, the shell or the layers is a good way of describing it, because at a high level, you have a KPI like, I don't know, trying to think, right? So I had like open incidents, and when you look at open incidents, you're going to think, okay, so this should be showing open incidents, like incidents that are currently open. But sometimes that definition is not as clear as an incident that is in state open. Because what is state open? And so a lot of those things have nuance. And understanding that nuance will really help with understanding why a score might not be appearing how it's supposed to appear, or how it is believed to appear. And that might not just be because of misunderstanding, it could also be because of misalignment too. Like we believe that currently open incidences are this, but some other organization or group might believe it's something else. So I guess that can kind of also cause issues. So in our case, kind of going back on that open incident, you have an open incident and then you deal again, that's the indicators also open incident. When you get into the indicator source, you see that incident table, but then you see also that the definition of open is, oh, it's an incident that is state open, but also is state new and is state in progress that happened yesterday or something. And so you don't account for those other states. So the number's looking larger than it actually is because you might think that it's only open. As well as when you go a little further now, or you go into like the breakdowns. So the breakdowns are the dimensions in which you gather the data to report. So you might have one of our breakdowns is like DPM service offerings. And a common one there is very a common miss is that the breakdowns themselves also have a source. And the source we see there, for example, for service offering, is that offering needs to be an operational status. And so it could just be as simple as updating your offering to operational, and then recalculating the score, and then you'll see the score you expect. And then to kind of even go further, you also just have how those breakdowns are mapped to that indicator or to that indicator source. So like incident, we might for an offering, it has to be on the service offering form, but maybe for to have the score count for the taxonomy node, it needs to be mapped to the offering, not just the service field. And maybe the incidents are all open on the service, but not the offering. Complicated, but the whole and I'm aware, and I'm sure talking about it hopefully made it a little less complicated, but it's more just identifying that there's a lot of layers here. And so understanding that sometimes the score is not appearing is because one of those layers is doing something that you're just not aware of. Did that make sense to you, Caitlin?
Yes, no, that's exactly right. And I think the other aspect would be a misalignment of data. So I do get a lot of questions from customers around how we, sort of how the breakdowns work, like how a record is mapped to the solution type. So if, where we were talking about service offerings, if we stick with that example, the way that an incident is mapped to a service offering, and if that mapping is not done per our conditions or our criteria, then the data is not going to show up. So for customers who are maybe starting with services and haven't defined their offerings yet, we do have like set conditions where the incident needs to be created against the service offering and then rolled up to the service, which is then rolled up to the taxonomy node and then all the way up to the portfolio. And if the data is not aligned that way, then the data is not going to show up in DPM. There's a lot of factors there. Yeah.
And I think it's safe to say like a lot of like the alignment we've done is pretty much with a CSDM, right?
Yes. Thank you for calling that out. So we do work closely with that team and have taken a real effort to stay aligned with that best practice. And we do try to make it flexible and support different use cases, but because it becomes really challenging to support every possible kind of instantiation of the data, we do kind of have to have a best practice, and have a data model. And so that is the data model that we use and is a good, like well-defined model and like white paper and use cases. So there is that support if needed.
Cool. Should I start showing off some of this, what it looks like inside of a ServiceNow instance?
Let's get into the troubleshooting, Aaron. That's the fun stuff. So
awesome. So let me kind of start showing this off, what this looks like in an actual instance. So we're going to start by going to our KPI groups. So this is just one of our kind of demo test instances. So it might not align exactly with your instances or any sort of like instance, but it's all configurable. So it all probably looks different anyways. But yeah, so right here, we're seeing all the KPI groups and we're seeing the different KPI group names and we're seeing how they're mapped as well. So actually, sorry, we are seeing the KPI group and the type of KPI group it can be associated to. So to better explain that, like performance snapshot can be associated with service portfolios. So we're going to go there. And what we're going to see here is now that we're looking at the KPI group, we see the 4 different KPIs that make up the KPI group. And we're seeing where it's mapped. So in this case, we're mapped to the enterprise technology service portfolio. And what that means inside of DPM, and correct me if I'm wrong, Caitlin, if you go to any of the items that are inside this portfolio, you should see this performance snapshot.
Yes, that's good. So the call out here is I do get quite a few questions around how to map a KPI group to more than one service at a time. And the trick is if you're using a service portfolio, then mapping that KPI group to either the top level portfolio, so like you're seeing here, or to create a KPI group for a taxonomy node, all of the children within that structure. So if we're looking at this portfolio, that includes the portfolio itself, all the taxonomy nodes, all the services, all the offerings will reflect those metrics.
is that true for just like if I map to a taxonomy node, then all of these services that are under that taxonomy node would also get it? Like it's not just limited to the portfolio level, right?
Exactly. That's actually how it works, sort of not regardless, but also yes, regardless. So what I mean is anything that has a child loosely using the word child, because a lot of these like the seem to
Yeah.
be relationship isn't child, but if there's a portfolio that has related taxonomy nodes, if those taxonomy nodes have related taxonomy nodes, or if they have related services and those services have related offerings, if you map a KPI group to anything above that service offering level, everything below it, like it will inherit down. And so if you map something at the offering level, there's nothing that will inherit from there. And then with the business applications, so we also include business apps and DPM. If you map a KPI group to a business application, the app services that are related to that business app will also inherit that KPI. And they have portfolios as well, and same rules apply there.
Yeah.
So the inheritance is nice.
Yeah.
It saves the mappings.
Yeah, no, and I've had that too. I've heard that same question. Oh, do I need to map this to every single service? And the answer is no. You
Yes.
can
And
go
one
to,
thing, while we're on this topic, we have this performance snapshot, which is like probably our most common
Mhm.
because we do ship it out of the box and you can immediately map it to your service portfolio and see some of these like fundamental KPIs, being tracked. The one call out is we do have a service performance KPI group, which is essentially like reflecting these same KPIs. Yeah, let's see, where did it go? Oh,
Um,
service metrics. Yeah, if you go to the service metrics up
yeah,
below.
sorry. Service metrics.
Yep.
Oh yeah, it's the same.
Yes. So we created this one for any customers who may not have their service portfolios built out yet. You don't have to have a service portfolio to use DPM, but you could map those same metrics directly to a service and then
Yep.
be able to see those on the offerings. So, like a little bit of a call out, you don't need to double map. Like this one, this KPI group should not be mapped to services that are already in a portfolio that has those performance
Yep.
snapshots. Yeah. Yep.
That's a
So
good call out. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to performance snapshot. So let's dig into a KPI real fast. So we'll do open incidents because that's what I talked about. How fitting. Um, okay, cool. So when we go here right now, we are looking at a yeah. So we're seeing all what kind of what we bring in here. So one label. You can change the labels of them, which is nice because that's separate from the name of the indicator. And then
and
this,
just to be super clear to your point, like the label, that is nice. That is what will show up in DPM.
yes.
So make that as clear as possible for your end user for what is shown there. Yep.
Yep. And then what we see over here is we have the aggregate. So like for example, in this instance, we are using the aggregate, not the current score. And so this is one of the first things probably worth really pointing out is if you're not using current score, then there's going to be this layer of aggregation that happens when you look at the snapshot or when you look at the KPIs when they're over a time period. So I think 30 days, for example, the score is going to be an average of whatever the data that was collected over those 30 days in this case. And chart type, where we can define the different charts, that's how they show up. Let me continue. Down here in related lists, we have the supporting KPIs. So if we click on this, it's going to look very similar to what we're already looking at. It should. And it's the same thing. This is kind of where you associate that these are going to be the ones that appear when you drill in. Yeah, anything else to point out on this page before I move on, Caitlin?
No, I think that's good. One other thing is the order all the way on the right. That determines the order with which it will show up in the DPM UI, kind of like first, second, third from left to right.
Yes, cool. Good call out. Okay, cool. Now we're going to dig in. And so we should be going to the actual indicator now. So now digging into the indicator, we can see number DPM, number of open incidents. We prefresh everything in DPM with the DPM, especially when we're starting talking about the performance analytics product, just to really differentiate the ones that are a part of DPM. So I'm not going to go describe every little detail of an indicator. There's a lot of documentation on it. It is complicated, but I think going through the idea of troubleshooting, I'll kind of point out some of the areas that lead to confusion first. And then I'll kind of circle back real fast through like remediation, I think. First thing, see here, the indicator source. So we've already talked about this quite a few times, but this is where it exists. Indicator source, this is the kind of like the core collection that is being collected for scores. So here we can see that it's an incident is the facts table and then the conditions. So in this case, and this is going to be, the date's going to be updated because the way we're looking at it, but it's probably a relative date. But we can see it's open on today or open before, and this is a relative date. And resolved is empty or resolved is greater than another relative date, and state is not canceled. So this is really important because there's a lot more conditions on here than just opened on today. And that's really important to note. That's just the first kind of layer on data collection. The next layer we're going to notice is breakdowns. So when we see these breakdowns, we have a lot of different breakdowns. They're all prefixed with DPM. And these are all essential to having the data show up on those solution pages. All of our out-of-box indicators have them, but when adding additional indicators, it's really important to add the breakdowns that make sense. And so we'll dig into one right now. So let's dig into, we'll do services. Actually, we'll just do offerings. So now when we look at one of these breakdowns, there's another layer to understanding what is the data being collected. When we dig into the breakdown source, we'll see we can start seeing here that there's even more definitions to what is a DPM service offering. So one, we know it's definitely on the service offering table, but we have other filters here. So service offerings with parents, and we need to know what the state is. These kind of like are other layers where confusion can occur when an incident isn't showing up potentially. But yeah, this is like totally worth noting and seeing. On top of that, we have the mappings too. So we can see some simpler mappings, like with service availability. For example, we look at the service offering field that exists on that record in order to map those service availability records. So, and that would be like with availability related KPIs. Whereas then for incident, we actually have a script. And I'm not going to click in and dig into it, but you can see that to basically map a incident to a breakdown, we have to have a scripted process of doing that. So understanding there is more to it than just potentially using the service offering field. And I think in this specific use case, it's actually just using the impacted services and affected CIs related list is why it's scripted. But yeah, it can get more complicated for things like taxonomy node and service portfolio when we have to look at all sorts of different areas.
That's exactly right, Aaron. So we do get a lot of questions about how we map data into DPM, like where those relationships come from. And that's a great place to start, actually, so that you start to see actually in the tool how we are creating those breakdowns, and yep, the fact that we have taken care to go through each type and make sure that it it is aligned with the CSDM, but it's also based on feedback and how customers are using the tools. An important factor.
And finally, kind of the last part of this whole anatomy is the job. And so the jobs, these are our out of box jobs, DPM daily data collection, and the historic one. And so the important thing here is that the DPM daily collection is active and it's set to be run scheduled. I could probably show that off. And yeah, we can see that here. So you can see like relative start, relative end. But this is important, and you're going to have a lot of job logs because it is running daily. So ours has been ran 194 times. And then these are those logs I kind of mentioned earlier that are really great diagnosis tools. So as we see here, we're getting no warning of errors, but if there is ever issues, this is probably one of the places to first start. And speaking of that, I guess we can kind of start getting into that. And kind of like I just said, but yeah, often when scores aren't appearing, going to the job log is a great place to start because that will really show you right off the bat if there's any errors. And then often we can kind of map, oh, that error is associated to this indicator, and that's why the score is not appearing. It's pretty cool. Warnings can also be noted. And the other kind of obvious thing too is you just want to make sure the job is running. And you can tell that because every log is recorded here when this job is ran. So that's kind of like always the first spot I kind of look, is just to make sure, like, is the data even being attempted to be collected?
And Aaron, do you find that for customers they're using our out of box indicators, they're using our jobs. Can you talk a little bit about why they might still run into, some of these errors potentially?
Oh yeah, customizations or potentially. So customizations on the records themselves. Um, yeah, I mean that's one big one. So like if there's added well, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. At customizations, and sometimes that can have unexpected results to the breakdown mappings because they are scripted. So things can change.
And
That's
that would
probably
typically, and sorry to interrupt you, but so if they did do some customizations, that would typically make itself known in errors in the job logs.
you would know what's airing. So you would know that like, okay, this indicator is failing, and usually will even tell you like this breakdown specifically is not working. And so then
Mm.
you could go to the breakdown and you need to have some knowledge to see like, oh, okay, I understand like, this customization I did is actually impacting one of the fields that is being used in like the breakdown mapping, or more often not in the breakdown script. The mappings are pretty straightforward, but it's the scripts is where you can potentially hit a snag due to customization.
Mm.
Um, Sometimes also, like the truth be told, I mean, like I think at this point we have much more confidence, but I mean, in the past we have seen bugs introduced by us. It happens, but we haven't had that in a long time. Usually that's not that's complicated to get into, but there's little reasons here and there that can happen. For the most part nowadays, yeah, it's usually due to configuration or customization.
That makes sense.
Yep. So let me continue. So I will look here just to make sure everything looks good. And I will say generally nowadays everything does look good. So then we have to kind of try a little bit harder. So I'm going to go back to the indicator. Okay, now that we're back on the indicator, I'm going to go to Analytics Hub. So this is probably what I'd recommend for most people. Like I said, the score sheet, it's just important to know kind of how this all works. It all gets recorded in a score sheet. But Analytics Hub is a definitely much friendlier tool to use. And honestly, as powerful, if not more powerful. And the reason why I say that is because here you can actually break down by individual breakdown items, and it's really neat. So, for example, let's say if I go to get access control, I'm expecting to see 14, but I'm only seeing 13. Well, if I go to show records, you can actually see the records that are showing up there. So you can figure out based off of that what additional records are showing up that you don't expect, or which ones are missing. That's why I really like Analytics Hub, to actually do like a deeper investigation, because I can see like the by breakdown and then see the individual records too. Plus, you get a history and you can adjust your window as much and little as you want.
And this is also a great tool, right, Aaron, to compare scores between what might be showing in DPM versus what is showing in here.
Yeah, and this is like really important because this, especially with that extra layer of aggregate, it can create kind of some misunderstanding. If I know, like, okay, well, it's 13 for this whole month. Why on, I guess kind of a bad example for average. But if I look here and let's say I've had some more variance here, right? And I'm like, well, it's 13, but then in DPM, it's telling me it's 14 or something. And then you can really understand, like, oh, that's just because it's an average. And I think there's even a way, yeah. And even here, it identifies the average. So what you can do if you're really confused is set the time frame as the same, and you should see the average matching if it is average. Now, there is some as well, so you can kind of see that those numbers should match up with what's in DPM based off of whatever aggregate's on, if it is on, to be fair. Yeah, that's a good call out. But yeah, this is a very, very powerful tool. Finally, though, so okay, if it's not showing up in the score sheet, then it's probably not showing up here in Analytics Hub. So what do we do next? So I go back to the indicator. Okay, cool. And so when we're at that point, it's got to be related probably to a mismapping of the core data. And so I've kind of already walked through it from the very beginning when going through the anatomy of everything, but it's really understanding from that point forward, if it's not showing up at any of those 2 points and your job is running, that it's either because of the way that you're using the record. So what I mean by that is the source record. So if you're expecting an incident to show up and it's not showing up, well, that might be because of any one of those kind of like previously mentioned areas of breakdowns, breakdown mappings, indicator source, breakdown source. All of those areas could be reasons why it's not working how you might expect it to work. Yeah, and unfortunately with that, there's no easy way to solve it. You really just kind of have to dig through those like prominent areas that can lead to confusion.
And do you find customers would potentially like modify the breakdowns or create their own breakdowns and be able to map those and use those instead?
That's a really good question about customizations in general. Modifying the breakdowns, I don't see very often and would probably not recommend for most cases. What we do see a lot of configuration of, though, is the indicators and even the indicator source to some degree, though you need to be careful customizing that just because it could impact many indicators. With an indicator, for example, additional conditions is something they can configure, and that's totally okay to do. Where there is something worth noting, though, is if wanting to add your own indicators to KPIs. And so when doing that, it's just really important, probably the most important thing, is to leverage our breakdowns. And because these are the breakdowns we consume in DPM. So by defining, you can have your own custom indicator, but you want to add our breakdowns and these specific ones to it. And there is some difficulties with that, specifically around scoping. So you can only add, basically, you can only associate different PA records to each other if they're in the same scope. So if there's a indicator you want to use that's in a different scoped app, for example, you wouldn't be able to associate our breakdowns to it. So in that case, the best solution is actually to duplicate the indicator in the scope of DPM and then add the breakdowns. And you shouldn't have an issue of data missing, I don't believe, because it is all going to the same sort of like facts table in the end.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. I think that is helpful because we do encourage, right? Like we ship
Mhm.
quite a few KPI groups and quite a few indicators. I
Yeah.
think the last I checked, we ship a total of like 110 indicators or something.
Well, right now we have 75, but that's not including all of the formula ones.
Right. Yes. So there are different types, the formula and automated, and we do have formula indicators. I think the note would be we expect, right,
Mhm.
a level of modification of those
Yep.
because we know that it's a good we try to provide a good, I'm going to use the word generic or standard, starting point, but in terms of flexibility and getting the exact metrics that need to be tracked for your organization, we do anticipate that they would need to be created, and ideally it can be done fair in a fairly straightforward manner, at least the KPI groups created and then mapped.
Yeah, and definitely I would think if for most customizations, the best level to do it, besides the KPI, would be to do it at this indicator level. In most cases, that should be fine, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of PA was designed to be configurable, and the only real kind of pitfall though with customization is really just some of the scope issues. But once you get around that, it's very configurable.
Are there
Mhm.
any other limitations or suggestions or any other tips that you've learned having worked with different customers and seeing different approaches to this?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's hard. I think the main thing is when we're using, so customers are going to have their own way they want to use data, and that's potentially, and that's fair. Often, for example, with breakdowns, we might deem an application service to be one thing, or we might deem a service offering that needs to be in a certain state. And you can configure that. And I think that's fine to fit your model. But there is just kind of just to be aware that some of these changes can be overarching. And that would be the number one thing. So when we sometimes, I'll look and notice, oh yeah, this one indicator or something's not working. The one thing is not working how it's supposed to work. And it's because, oh, there was changes made somewhere else to some other indicator, whether that be like the indicator source or the breakdown mapping. So that would be kind of the one thing I would say that's really worth noting is, like I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, is if you're going to change the indicator source directly, like the values, the definition of a source, just be careful because that can potentially impact other indicators. And that's fine to do because that might be what you want to do. You might want anything that's referencing open incidents to not involve resolved or necessarily state canceled or something. And that's totally fine to customize. Just be aware that it can impact many other KPIs and indicators. And often the other solution is just to create a brand new indicator source and just swap it in if that's the case. If it's just for this specific indicator. That's just one example of just kind of like a general, just kind of be aware of the reuse of many of the items that exist in PA.
Yeah, that's a good call out. The other thing I wonder about is the jobs. So we have our jobs that run every 24 hours, and I have gotten feedback or requests about seeing data more. I'll use the word timely, so that it's not yesterday's data, but it's maybe data that was like 4 hours ago, or whatever sort of the occurrence would be. For that, again, do you recommend creating a new job and specifying that cadence versus modifying the jobs that we have shipped?
That's another good question. No, I mean modification is fine, and the reason why is because we rarely ever update the job itself. What we do update is the kind of MTOM or the indicators associated to the job. So if you do configure the job, then if we introduce brand new indicators, you will still get those indicators associated to that job. I'll leave that as an interpretation if that's a good or bad thing, depending on if you don't want newer indicators and you want indicators to be set the way they are, then creating your own job is the way to go. And that's fine too. You can just duplicate it, make sure to turn the original one off and just run your new one. But it really just depends on that use case. Do you want newer updates do you want new indicators? If we introduce new ones to show up automatically, then just update the existing. If you don't want that to happen, then just create your own job. And same thing, and you can run it however you want. Like I said, we run it daily. You could update that to run sooner. They'll probably just want to make sure it just doesn't overlap, like collection times overlap, because that can cause delays and potentially cause kind of a weirdness with data.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Very good.
Good questions.
Yeah. All very good information. I'm asking because I get these questions too, and I don't always know the answer. So
Yeah.
I think this will be super helpful. And thank you so much for walking through all these tips and how to, take actions, not only based on what you're seeing, but then what to do, making sure the jobs are active, making sure the indicators are mapped to jobs, and making sure the breakdowns are mapped to the indicators. So if there are any other final thoughts that you have or any final words of wisdom you want to leave us with, I think we can wrap up today's video.
Yeah. No, the last thing I was just gonna say is, this was a pleasure to do, and I hope it's helpful. The kind of last thing I say though overall is PA performance analytics it is a pretty large product and there is a lot of documentation there. So when kind of going through KPIs, we have documentation in DPM, but it's always worth to kind of read up on PA, and they are very well documented. So definitely can help as well.
Yes. And when in doubt, please don't hesitate to open a case. We're here to help, and we want to make you as successful as possible, as quick as possible. With that, thank you so much, Aaron. It's always such a pleasure to chat with you and kind of really dig into these topics. I think it's so fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you, Caitlin. Always a pleasure to talk to you too.
All right. Till next time.
Bye.